Greeting everybody. This video brings us to a new chapter called Teaching and Learning Grammar. We have covered teaching language constructions, teaching vocabulary, and teaching pronunciation. So teaching and learning grammar is another language skill that is probably one of the hardest skills for teachers to obtain, especially when it comes to transferring grammar knowledge to students in a meaningful and effective way. Therefore, our chapter focuses on three major aspects of grammar teaching and learning that teachers or future teachers alike should keep in mind when teaching grammar to students. They are number one, the key principles of grammar teaching; number two, issues about how to teach grammar; number three, some grammar techniques that teachers can make use of when teaching grammar to students in their class. However, in this video, we are going to touch on just the first two major points of this chapter. Before we get to those, as teachers, it is important that you take a step back and look at your own opinions on grammar in learning or teaching English. How important do you think grammar plays a role in learning or teaching English? How do you or how will you approach grammar when teaching English in your class? Should you make grammar teaching the main focus of your teaching? Do you think it's possible for students to acquire grammar as they learn the language without having to make grammar teaching the center of your language learning? Now, reflecting on these questions should shape the way you approach English teaching as a whole and dictate your focus in your teaching styles. That is because some teachers think that we don't need to teach grammar so explicitly to students. Learners will just pick up grammar on their own, just give them exercises to do at home. There's no need to waste time teaching grammar in class. It's better to focus on communication instead. But there are other teachers who think that they feel the need to teach grammar rules and uses first. Let students practice to better prepare them for any activities that may require grammar. But what's yours? What is your own opinions on the role of grammar teaching? Now that you have thought about how important grammar teaching is to you as a teacher personally, it is time for us to look at the key principles of grammar teaching. What is it that teachers should be aware of when they approach grammar teaching? The first key principle that teachers should always keep in mind is that grammar teaching and learning must be meaningful. But what do we mean by that? Grammar learning becomes meaningful when students get to see the connection and the relevance grammar has with real-life context, the connection to their own personal goals of learning a language, for example, such as communications. Grammar learning can be meaningful when it involves students' engagement of some sort, and it gives them the opportunities to apply what they have learned in an authentic task or tasks or activities. And it's not just simply about learning how to form a sentence, learning grammatical rules. It's not just about those. If it's just about those, grammar is not meaningful. The question is, how can we make grammar learning meaningful? Well, there are two ways you can go about doing this. First and foremost is to challenge your students to think when you teach grammar to them. Whatever grammar point you teach, students should have at least some opportunities to be challenged to process the input you are giving to them at that moment. It doesn't have to be anything too challenging, too difficult, too deep, just enough for them to think about what they see and what they hear from you. To do this, you can use one of the many activities called substitution drill to get students to think. So let's say that you are teaching the modal verb can, and you show a picture of a person swimming, and you give a model sentence, she can swim. And now you show another picture of a person driving. And then you ask your students to try and think of a sentence for this picture. Now, here students say, she can drive. As you can see, students substituted the word swim with the word drive based on the picture you showed to them. Therefore, students have now been challenged to process what they see and try to think of another way to describe the picture using the target grammar, which is can. Another way of challenging them to think is to ask them what the grammar means instead of telling them yourself. When you have done enough substitution drills with the modal verb can, for example, you can now challenge them to think about what this model expresses in the form of concept checking questions. You may ask them something like, okay, everybody, what do you think the modal verb can expresses? When you do so, students now need to engage and be involved in the process of thinking of what they have been expressing so far with the use of can. What have I done here with the use of can? I've done a lot. What does it mean? Another way of challenging them to think is making use of situation cues. What is it exactly? So let's say you are teaching students about the use of be going to talk about future prediction. You give them a cue in the form of a sentence. So you say, it's already 7 and John is still in bed. Then you give students a model response using be going to. So you say, he is going to be late. Now you give students another cue, which says, John is very hungry. So here you may expect responses from students such as, he is going to cook some food, he is going to buy some food, or he is going to eat breakfast. Well, whatever that is, the point here is, well, it isn't to get them to produce a fixed response, okay? It's not about asking them to produce the correct response, but it's about challenging them to think of a response using the target grammar be going to for prediction, while allowing them to have the opportunity to actually predict a situation based on your cues. There's another way you can do this. Instead of giving them cues in the form of sentences, you can actually use pictures as a situation cue instead of, sentences. For example, you give them this picture. Now they see a picture of this person. The students can see some clues such as the word Victor and the race. So by looking at the picture, they have to think of a response or a sentence using the target grammar be going to and the words they see on that picture to predict what is going to happen. So now students may say, he is going to win the race. The second way you can make your grammar teaching and learning more meaningful is to personalize your grammar. By personalizing, we mean by using real-life examples or sentences that you think relate to students' knowledge or real-life experience. Things that they see, things that they hear, things that they do, or things that they interact with on a daily basis. So let's just say that you are teaching students the use of the past simple tense today. Okay, so you give them a sentence which says, the archaeologists discovered ancient artifacts from the sites in 1995. Now, this sentence does elicit the use of the past simple tense, but it isn't something that is easy for students to comprehend, to understand. Number one, there's just too many difficult words there that your students may not have heard or seen before. Number two, your students might not have any idea as to what it is about. So instead of giving such examples to explain the use of the past simple, you should personalize your examples by giving sentences about themselves. For example, you may write something like, "We went on a school trip yesterday." Instead of giving sentences like this, you can also ask questions, to not just personalize the grammar, but also challenge your students to think at the same time. So you may ask questions like, "What time did you wake up this morning?" And then your students may respond, "I woke up at 6 this morning." You may continue asking another question. "So are you still sleeping?" Students may say, "No, I'm not." Or, "Did it happen already?" Students may say, "Yes, it did." So now students learn something that is personalized to them. They get to be challenged to think, they get to produce the response using the target language, and they get to learn the use of the past simple tense, which is in this case your main objective. The second key principle of grammar teaching and learning is to transfer new grammar patterns or forms to different topic, or to show students that grammar patterns or forms they learned are useful in various contexts. So let's just use "be going to" one more time for prediction as an example. It is not recommended that you focus on having students use the target grammar "be going to" just to predict about future jobs, for example. Students only produce sentences such as, "He is going to be a doctor," "She is going to be a teacher." These sentences are under the theme of future jobs. Instead, show them that "be going to" or any grammar point that you are teaching can be used under many themes and topics. Things like weather, "It is going to be sunny tomorrow." Business, "This company is going to earn a lot of money." Science, "The scientists are going to build a new rocket." Environment, "People are going to use more plastics." Therefore, we as teachers should use our target grammar point in various topics too, not just for students, but for us too. We need to show to students that this grammar point can be useful in any aspects, in any situations. The more examples in different contexts students meet, the more they understand the concept, the meaning of using that target grammar. So sometimes a few sentences, a few examples might just not be enough for students at all. Also, teachers should give students opportunities to produce sentences using the target grammar under many topics too. They are learning at that moment, so we should get them to produce at that moment. While you are asking students to produce sentences, you can make that into an activity where they produce sentences for each other to use. For example, you are teaching comparative patterns, comparative structures. You put students in groups and work together to create a list of sentences using comparative patterns. You make it clear that students must produce sentences under various topics they can think of. So one group writes down these sentences. Okay, the Basak River is wider than the Mekong River. The Thailand is bigger than Laos. Lions are more violent than elephants. You ask groups to exchange their sentences. So from here, you can do many things. You can turn this activity into meaning-based, where students decide whether the information they read from the other group is true or false. Or you can turn this activity into focusing on the formation of the sentences, where students work to spot any mistakes that the other group has made when creating these comparative sentences. But you need to keep in mind that not only do students get to use the target language, but they also get to create examples under various topics that are personalized to them, and they have time to think of their own sentences. Besides creating example sentences under various topics, teachers can use what we call mini contexts to help make meaning clearer to students. This is because sometimes the topics teacher introduced to students might be unfamiliar to them. So to help make it clear, teachers can use contexts of the topic as clues to help students understand the target grammar at the same time its meaning. For example, your target grammar today is be going to for future prediction again, and your theme is environment. So you create a sentence which says, people are going to use more plastic in the future. To make the meaning of this sentence a little bit clearer, add a bit of context to it, mini context to it. So now it becomes, plastic is cheap and there are many things coming from plastic. They are water bottles, bags, and toys. People are going to use more plastic in the future. That is your focused sentence. So this mini context around it should help students understand the meaning of this sentence. But you need to keep in mind though, that teachers should only use grammar patterns that they know students already know for the mini contexts to, avoid confusion or being exposed to something new while learning the target language. So keep in mind, whatever context you want to use, make sure that the grammar patterns in that context, the vocabulary in that context is already known to your students. Another way of testing students' understanding while transferring grammar to various topics is the use of concept checking questions. Instead of asking questions like, do you understand? Do you have any questions? Which we do all the time. The answer to those questions will be most likely a no or nothing. Teachers can instead ask questions to check their understanding. Let's just say that you teach the use of the past simple tense today, something that finished in the past. After finishing that grammar point, ask students if they understand that use. For example, you can start asking questions such as, what did you do this morning? So students may say, well, I ate breakfast with my mom. When did it happen? It happened this morning. Are you still eating breakfast now? Students may say, well, no, I'm not. So here, this shows that they actually understood that the past simple tense already finished in the past and it's no longer true today at this moment. Now, this is when you focus on the meaning, the use of the past simple tense, but you can instead focus on the form, the rule of the form of the past simple tense. For example, you give a sentence, he did not walk to school. You can start asking questions such as, why does walk not have ed with it? Why do we use did in this sentence? Right? So these questions provoke students to think of why it happened, why it is formed that way. Another key principle that teachers must bear in mind when teaching grammar is that they should always use vocabulary that students already know with new grammar patterns. This is to make sure that the students focus solely only on the new grammar patterns and not be distracted by difficult words around them at that same time. So please make sure that when you introduce a new sentence, okay, a grammar pattern, the vocabulary in that sentence must be something students already know. Which leads us to the fourth key principle, which is learn good basic vocabulary speeds up grammar learning. It is important that students have good and basic vocabulary in hands because this helps speed up grammar learning. When students know a lot of common words, it is easier for teachers, right? It is easier for teachers to come up with meaningful examples while teaching the target grammar without having to spend too much time deciding which words students know and which they don't. And we have already studied how, to teach basic vocabulary without the need for grammar, but you cannot teach grammar without vocabulary. Another key principle of teaching grammar is that teachers should get students to have a lot of comprehension practice with the new grammar they teach. To become more familiar with the grammar, students should have a few minutes of listening to how the grammar is used and read a text or two that consists of the target grammar. Then they should have enough input now before they can actually be asked to produce a written work or maybe speaking using the target language. So now that they have been exposed to enough practices that allow them to understand the target language and target grammar and how it is used, they will produce the work using the target grammar with very, very minimal mistakes, which is what we want. Another key principle of teaching grammar is that teachers should know that techniques from other skills such as speaking, writing, reading, and listening can be used to help with grammar practice too. There are 3 ways teachers can implement the techniques from other skills to help with this grammar practice. First and foremost, teachers can use a list of sentences or phrases as a data for a specific technique. The sentences and phrases have to be meaningful, they have to be under various topics, and they should all consist of the target grammar that the teachers teach. Teachers then select some techniques that they think can help students practice the patterns of the sentences and phrases, such as drill, substitution table, or maybe true-false statements, to focus on patterns or meanings according to the teacher's objectives. Secondly, instead of using sentences or phrases, teachers can use a short or simple text that contains and focuses on the target grammar. For example, teachers want to focus on irregular verbs and regular verbs of the past simple tense. So they let students read a short simple story containing the verbs. They can then think of a technique or two to help practice with the verbs. Techniques such as rub off and remember, bingo, or categories can be used to help students with regular verbs and irregular verbs from that reading text. The third and final way of using other techniques from other skills to help practice with grammar is that teachers directly put the target patterns or rules of a grammar on the board as guides for students to perform a technique in order to practice the target grammar patterns or rules. So let's say you have your past, you teach past simple tense focusing on form and meaning. So now you write guides on the board, as in this example activity right here. So the target pattern is yesterday I blank and blank. And then you give them some inputs. Okay, vocabulary, we have verbs. Okay, go, play, eat, and watch. Places, park, school, home, object, pizza, movie, and football. Based on the patterns, based on the guides, based on the vocabulary given, students have to perform this technique by describing what they did yesterday to help them practice not just the form, but also producing their own examples at the same time. Another key principle that should be kept in mind in connection with the previous principle is that teachers must ensure that they get students to practice the target grammar in all 4 skills. This is to help them reinforce their grammar through meaningful repetition in all 4 skills, to help them apply grammar in real-life situations, to read and hear how grammar is actually used, to encourage a variety of activities for the target grammar, and basically overall help students prepare for all forms of communication using the target grammar. Another key principle when teaching grammar, especially about the formation of sentences, is that teachers are encouraged to use declaratives, which means, simple or positive sentences, more than interrogatives, which means questions, as examples to help elicit the formation of sentences. So the reason for these are because, well, starting off with question forms immediately when introducing new grammar patterns, or, using questions as examples to introduce the forms, can confuse students because question forms take away, the the important component of a simple form. For example, the sentence is, she walks to school. When you introduce the question instead of the affirmative sentence, the declarative sentence, it becomes, does she walk, without s, to school? So the question form takes away the ending s of the word walk, which is quite important in the formation of the present simple tense. So therefore, we are not recommended that we start off with question forms as examples to introduce new grammar. Okay, or at least to help students learn grammar faster. Another reason for this is because question forms, they should be introduced after students are quite familiar with the positive forms, and you should do so in a guided way too. Okay, you should not only, but you should be encouraged to introduce question forms to students when they are already familiar with how they can form sentences normally using the target grammar. Another reason why questions aren't, encouraged to be introduced to students immediately is because questions are not that common in English outside of classroom. Students, find themselves give statements, declaratives more than, asking questions, right? Or they may find themselves being asked questions by people more than they ask questions themselves. So learning questions first, or being exposed to question formations of a new grammar first, isn't, a good way of helping students learn grammar faster. The last key principle teachers should know is that meaningful practice is always more important than presentation in learning and teaching grammar. What teachers should know is that grammar should be introduced quickly, but also efficiently. And then students should have the chance to practice what has been introduced to them right after on that same day. So after introducing them to a new grammar pattern, students will not be clear yet as to how it is formed or what meaning the grammar conveys, which brings us to the practice and production, where we focus on the difference of control. So these two come down to how much control teachers have. In reality, practice stage or production can be quite similar. However, it comes down to how much control teachers have on the two. The practice stage can be strongly led by teachers because they want students to be prepared. Here, teachers want to make sure that their students truly know and are able to use the target grammar correctly to a certain degree before allowing them to produce on their own freely in the production stage, where they expect very minimal mistakes of the use of the target language. And when it comes to presenting new grammar, many ways can confuse us and students themselves. Sometimes we feel like we want our presentation of the grammar to be as engaging as possible. We attempt to make use of pictures, actions, or some sort of conversations to lead students into the new grammar. But these can, take too much time for teachers to think of. They may just take too much class time, and they may just confuse students or don't lead them into our new grammar clearly. Sometimes it may be more efficient for teachers to just introduce new grammar using their own native language with lots of meaningful examples that are personalized and relevant to students' knowledge, since this way works with all grammar forms and items. Then teachers can decide, whether they want to introduce, you know, students, let students discover the form or meaning on their own, or tell them directly. But the idea here is to get students equipped with the tools to practice the target grammar when they actually, move on from the presentation stage. So now we have come to the issues about how to teach grammar. And the first issue is, should grammar be taught inductively or deductively? Should we present grammar to students inductively or deductively? Do students benefit more from discovering rules and uses on their own from some input from teachers of the target grammar? Or should teachers just give them rules and ask students to practice the rules instead? Which is better? So we have the inductive teaching, which is often praised for making grammar more meaningful and context-driven. It encourages autonomy and allows students to internalize grammar in a more natural way, which is similar to how they would learn in real life. Students then feel more motivated and engaged, active to discover on their own rather than being told what to do, how to think. And then we have the deductive teaching. This deductive teaching can be more efficient and can be easier for some learners who prefer structure and clarity. It is helpful when students need to understand complex rules quickly, right? Instead of spending time trying to work things out on their own when they literally have no ideas at all. They get to sit and listen to their teachers guiding them how this rule comes about or how it should be done. Okay, so it is more helpful. But which one is better? This question is, it's a question without an answer. It's a question that only you have an answer for. But there are teachers who prefer the balanced approach, right? Many teachers actually combine both methods, what we call a blended approach, where students are first introduced to the grammar inductively through context, through examples, and then teacher provides the rule deductively to clarify their understanding later on. So at first they get to induce the meaning of the grammar pattern, but at the end of the class or later or after that activity, teachers will be the one guiding them one more time just to make sure we are clear with what we are learning, right? Okay, so this way students get to benefit, from both discovering and also clear guidance from their teacher too. But either way, only the teacher of his or her class knows exactly what works best for their own students. The second issue is, should teachers use grammatical explanation and technical terminology in their classroom? Well, you see, sometimes we as teachers are so focused on attaching technical terms for a certain grammar, not knowing that students are already learning the language and being told the technical terms of the grammar just adds more complexity and stress to them. For example, students are already overwhelmed by the use of and, but, so, for, because, but then you attach the term conjunctions to them. It just makes it more complicated for students. They're already learning the language and now they have to learn all these terms. Sometimes it may just not be that appropriate to introduce these technical terms to students all at once. So try to keep your explanation short, sweet. Use your own language to explain if you have to. Try to use pictures, visuals to help with explanations if direct explanations are difficult to get across to students. Give clear examples. Okay, try not to go over exceptions in English. Now, you may let students know when you come across it later in order not to confuse students with the rules you already illustrate to them. Okay, for example, you already told them that this is how it works, and then an exception comes up. Okay, so now you spend time trying to go over the exceptions all at once. So these just add more stress on top of already stressful things that students are dealing with. So when it pops up, you let them know. Otherwise, tell them that this is how it works. Just follow it. Okay. The last one is that when you don't have an answer to a question from a student, try not to avoid. Try not to give an answer anyway, knowing that you may just risk giving a wrong answer. Okay, just tell them you don't know. Okay, there's nothing embarrassing about that. Telling them a wrong answer is more embarrassing than saying that you don't know. Not everybody knows everything about a language, right? Okay, we don't even know a lot about our Khmer language. So try not to tell them answers, give them answers, even if you are not clear with those answers. Okay, we don't want to tell people wrong answers or give them wrong answers. Okay, right. Instead, tell them that you don't know. We'll get back to them later on. Or you may tell students to do their own research, get back to you with their data, and then you and that students can discuss. Another issue is whether grammar should just be taught in a separate class alone, which means we have one class dedicated to just grammar teaching and learning. While this could work, but only under certain conditions. Number one, the grammar class is introduced separately to the curriculum so that students can use this to help with their other work that requires English. Number two, it is introduced this way in a separate class like this for the purpose of enhancing students' ability to use English in other fields of work. Or it is only to help students deal with a specific problem with a specific grammar. Or it is only for the purpose of revising, right? Of revising, grammar patterns or rules that may not be well understood enough to students yet. But it should not be a class dedicated to equip students with the English skills. Okay, students should not go to a separate grammar class alone and expect to learn how to speak or how to read or how to write or how to communicate using the language. That is not going to work with just grammar and grammar and grammar only in a single class. Okay, so without these conditions, having a separate grammar class isn't beneficial for students who try to learn a language, because grammar should always be integrated in all four skills, and students should be able to use grammar in all forms of communication. Another issue is whether teachers should correct grammatical errors in writing, speaking, or other skills or not. Obviously, we should correct errors. The issue isn't with the fact that we should or should not correct errors. The issue here is whether correcting errors, grammatical errors, is necessary or important when it comes to improving students' ability or not. Surprisingly, there isn't, a data or a study into this saying that when you correct errors, students magically become better. But there is a study on the way you correct. If you do not correct students in a good way or in an appropriate way, this can just negatively impact learners instead of helping them. So as teachers, it is important that you consider these things when you correct grammar mistakes. Number one, will it disrupt communicative flow while students speak? If so, consider waiting until the speaking is done and elicit to them after. Should you encourage self-correction, or you tell them the mistakes they make directly? Should you correct mistakes in front of the whole class or privately to avoid personal problems? Because, some students can be quite sensitive when being put on the spot, and correcting them in front of everybody may just discourage their self-confidence to speak again, because they are afraid of making that same mistakes. And one more thing, when you correct grammar errors in writing, for example, it is recommended that you give students chances to have their first draft, their second draft, to just look for mistakes on their own, correct them on their own as much as they can. So the final product of their writing should have very few mistakes at least, right? Okay, so again, when you correct grammar errors, consider a few things. Okay, personally, right, professionally, Okay, yeah, these things play a major role in demotivating or motivating students to learn, to keep going.